Welcome to the Brief History Podcast. My name's Andrew Knight, your host. The music and editing has been done by Harry Edmondson. This is the Brief History Podcast. We give you the history behind the headlines. History packed under an hour, perfect for your commute home, on your lunch break, or in your precious free time, or even when you're doing your chores. Today's episode is part 2 of the history of US immigration, the war, and Trump's border control. In part 1, we talked about how in recent weeks we've seen US immigration fiercely upheld with the separation of families, insomuch as children being caged up at the border as a deterrent and then the parents sent back home. A complete outrage and a clear human rights violation. The UN are currently being involved in that. Sides for and against both agree that the Immigration of the United States Act is severely lacking, and immigration laws do need to be reformed, whether that's for pro or con immigration. Whichever way you look at that, it's not working at the moment. In episode 1, we looked at the history of immigration to the United States, detailing the movement of people to the US, starting the first settlements from Europe from around 1600. The beginning around this time of British and other Europeans settled primarily on the East Coast. Later Africans who were imported as slaves. The United States experienced successive waves of immigration, particularly from Europe. Immigrants sometimes paid the cost of transoceanic transportation by becoming indentured servants after their arrival in the New World. Indentured servants essentially means where you get free passage, you get free housing and food at your destination, but you serve for a set period of time throughout that period, but then you didn't get paid a wage, and then at the end of the time, after everything was finished, you then become free. Later, immigration rules became more restrictive. The ending of numerical restrictions occurred in 1965. Recently, the advent of cheap air travel had increased immigration from Asia and other Latin American countries. Though attitudes between new immigrants, well, wherever they come from, has cycled between favourable and hostile since the 1790s. The 1959 Cuban Revolution, led by Fidel Castro, drove the upper middle classes to exile. This was facilitated by the 1966 Cuban Adjustment Act, which gave permanent resident status to Cubans physically present in the United States for 1 year. The Hellcat Act changed with this passage in 1965, a byproduct of the Civil Rights Revolution and a draw in the crown of the President Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs. The measures not been intended to stimulate immigration from Asia, the Middle East, Africa and elsewhere in the developing world. Rather, by doing away with this racially based quota system, its authors had expected that immigrants would come from, quote, traditional, end quote, societies such as Italy, Greece and Portugal, places that laboured under very small quotas in the 1924 law. The law replaced the quotas with preferential categories based on family relationships and job skills, giving particular preference to potential immigrants with relatives in the United States and with occupations deemed critical by the US Department of Labour. After 1970, however, following an influx from European countries, immigrants from places like Korea, China, India and the Philippines, as well as Pakistan and all countries in South Africa, became more common. In 1986, the Immigration Reform and Control Act, the IRCA, was passed, creating for the first time penalties for employers who hired illegal immigrants. The IRCA was proposed by Congress, was projected to give amnesty to about 1 million workers in the country illegally. In practice, Amnesty for about 3 million immigrants already in the United States was granted. Most were from Mexico. Legal Mexican immigrant family numbers were 2,001,098,000 in 1980, 4,289,000 in 1990, and 7,841,000 in the year 2000. Adding another 12 million illegal immigrants, of which about 60% are thought to be Mexicans, would bring the Mexican family total to over 16 million, about 16% of the Mexican population. Now, that being said, with Mexican immigration, this is what has led us to Trump's war. Trump insisted that Mexico would have to be part of any spending deals to prevent a government shutdown. President Trump himself tweeted, quote, "The Democrats don't want money from budget going to the border war despite the fact it will stop drugs and a very bad MS-13 gang members," end quote. Though the Democrats have insisted for months that they will not agree to any funding package that includes the war, with both houses of Congress in session facing less than a week to broker a deal before reaching a deadline that triggers a partial shutdown, the stakes are high. After taking a hard-line stance on Sunday and early morning, the administration team seemed to soften by Monday afternoon about forcing war funding to be included in the deadline spending package. Talk of the border war has been in the news since the Trump campaign officially began in 2015, though the idea has changed considerably since those first days. Now, when Donald Trump initially announced his candidacy for the presidency, he is quoted as saying, "I will build a great wall, and nobody builds walls better than me, believe me, and I'll build them very inexpensively. I will build a great, great wall on our southern border, and I will make Mexico pay for that wall. Mark my words." So repeatedly, the candidate Trump uses rhetoric about building walls to activate his base at campaign rallies, and he always insists that Mexico will pay for it. Even by July 2016, the Republican Party at their national convention in Cleveland adopts the amended platform that includes the war. Even Trump's advisor, Rudy Giuliani, insists that if Trump doesn't get the support of Congress to build the wall, he will simply accomplish it through executive order. Now, 2 years on, this wall hasn't been built, though still Trump's demands it. They demand that Mexico pay for it, and Trump uses the war to get what he wants from Democrats by threatening them and making it part of a negotiation package. But from May, leading up to this, the children have been separated from their parents after crossing the Southern U.S. border. This is according to the Department of Homeland Security, as part of a new immigration strategy by the Trump administration. This has provided widespread condemnation, calls that this is a illegal act, an attack on human rights, and the UN needs to step in for this violation. President Trump signed an executive order reversing his policy of separating the families and replacing it with a policy of detaining entire families together, including children, but ignoring the length of time limits on detention of minors. So what he's saying now is, all right, we're not going to separate the kids, but what we're going to do is we'll just lump everybody into cages together, and that should shut them up. It has now come to light that Trump administration did have a policy of separating families at the border. In April, U.S. Attorney General Jeff Sessions ordered prosecutors along the border to, quote, adopt immediately a zero-tolerance policy, end quote, for illegal border crossing. That included prosecuting parents traveling with their children as well as people who subsequently attempted to request asylum. White House officials have repeatedly acknowledged that under this policy, they separate all family who cross the border. Sessions has described it as deterrent. U.S. Customs and Border Protection explains on its site and in a flyer that border crossing families will be separated. The policy was unique to the Trump administration. Previous administrations did not, as a general principle, separate all families crossing the U.S. border illegally. After this, Trump ended the policy of family separation and replaced it with a policy of family detention. He signed an executive order that kept the zero policy in place, but added, quote, "It is also the policy of this administration to maintain family unity, including by detaining alien families together where appropriate and consistent with law and available resources," end quote. It did provide an exception for when authorities believed keeping the family together would be harmful for the child. In signing the order, Trump noted, quote, "There may be some litigation," end quote. That is a legal challenge to this new policy. In 2015, a court order based on a document called the Flores Settlement prevents the government from keeping migrant children in detention for more than 20 days. Trump had instructed Attorney General Jeff Sessions to ask the federal court to modify that agreement in order to allow children and, by extension, unified families to be kept in detention without a time limit. The request asked specifically for permission from the courts to, quote, "to detain alien families together throughout the pendency of criminal proceedings for the improper entry or any removal or other immigration proceedings," end quote. Trump also calls for branches of his administration to make facilities available for detaining families with children and calls on the Defense Department to build new facilities, quote, "if necessary," end quote. The Obama administration practiced family detention until the court order prohibited it. Many of the same groups that had been vocally denounced family separation also opposed to family detention and urged supervised release instead. Children currently remain separated from their parents. In signing the order, Trump said it would keep families together, quote, "in the immediate days forward," end quote. It is not clear when or how currently separated families will be reunited. So what happens when families are separated? The process begins at a Customs and Border Protection detention facility. Many details of what happens next, how children are taken, their parents or by whom, are still unclear. According to the Texas Civil Rights Project, which has been able to speak with detained adults, multiple parents reported they were separated from their children and were not given information about where their children would go. The organisation also says that in some cases the children were taken away under pretense they were getting a bath. The Los Angeles Times spoke to unnamed Homeland Security officials who said parents were given information about the family separation process and that, quote, "accusations of surreptitious efforts to separate are completely false," end quote. From the point of separation forward, the policy for treating the separated children appears to be the same as existing systems for detaining and housing unaccompanied immigrant children, designed for minors who cross the border alone. Those unaccompanied minors are generally older than the children affected by the family separation. Where do they go when they are separated? This answer varies over time. Children begin at Customs and Border Protection facilities, are transferred to longer-term shelters, and are supposed to eventually be placed with families or sponsors. Customs and Border Protection facilities, you may have seen the photos of the children in what looks like chain link cages, whether unaccompanied minors in 2014 or separated children in 2018. They are probably photos from Customs and Border Protection facilities. Children usually are held here initially, but it is illegal to keep them for more than 3 days. These holding cells are not meant for long-term detention. The Associated Press visited one site on Monday and described, quote, a large dark facility, end quote, with separate wings for children, adults and families. Quote, inside an old warehouse in South Texas, hundreds of children wait in a series of cages created by metal fencing. One cage had 20 children inside. Scattered about are bottles of water, bags of chips, and large foil sheets intended to serve as blankets, end quote. Such facilities have been criticised before for poor conditions and reports of abuse and inhumane treatment, including a number of allegations a CBP strongly denies. Child immigrant shelters. Within 3 days, children are supposed to be transferred from immigration detention to the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which is part of the Department of Health and Human Services. For 15 years, the ORR has handled the care and placement of unaccompanied migrant children. Until recently, that usually meant minors who crossed into the US alone. Now it also includes children who had been separated from their families by the authorities, including much younger children. On a call front with reporters on Tuesday, a Border Patrol official said it's a matter of discretion how young is too young for a child to be separated from their parents. In general, though, the age of 5 has been used as a benchmark, with younger children that are called tender-aged. The CEO of Southwest Key, which operates 26 ORR shelters, tell NPR the children at these facilities range from ages 0 to 17. On the same call, a HHS official said that some of the ORR shelters are specifically equipped to take care of children younger than 13. He provided few details and could not say how many children under 13 or under 5 or under 2 are currently held by HHS. Now the Associated Press reports that it is located 3 centers in Texas that, quote, have been rapidly repurposed to serve the needs of children, including some under 5, quote, end quote, with a 4th shelter scheduled to open in Houston. Infants among the detained children, the AP reports. The ORR has a network of about 100 shelter facilities, all operated by non-profit groups where children are detained. NPR's John Burnett recently joined other reporters to visit one such facility, a converted Walmart supercenter housing nearly 1,500 boys aged 10 to 17. Journalists' access to that facility in Brownsville, Texas was limited, but the site was markedly different from the CBP facilities seen in photos released by the government. The teenage boys slept on beds instead of mats on the floor, in rooms instead of cages, and had access to classes and games. ORR says children remain at these shelters for, quote, fewer than 57 days on average, end quote. However, some children have been detained for months longer than that, and some advocates say certain facilities improperly administer psychotherapeutic medications. Observers have raised concerns about the psychological toll on young children who enter this shelter system. NPR's Joel Ross talked to one former shelter employee who quit after he was instructed to prevent siblings from hugging each other. The organisation that runs the shelter said it allows touching and hugging in certain circumstances. More than 10,000 migrant children, including children who cross the border alone, are kept in ORR facilities, and existing facilities are filling up. The shelter Burnett visited, 95% were full. Temporary facilities have been set up in Tenillo, Texas, near El Paso. Little is known about the facility, and reporters have not been allowed inside, but KQED's John Sepulveda has seen a tent camp from outside. It's a heavy-duty grade white tent in the middle of a desert, he told the NPRS Here and Now. Quote, it's behind 2 chain-link fences and there's a dirt easement that's on top of it, so you can't actually see into from the American side. End quote. The tent camp popped up rapidly, with the first large white tent appearing essentially overnight. Within days, a complex of smaller tan tents surrounded it. Photos released by the HHS show bunk beds packed tightly into the tents. It's not clear how many teenagers are inside. Suplevado says that the government are planning to expand it to hold some 4,000 detained minors. This is not the first time in the US government history that it used temporary shelters for minors. During the surge of the unaccompanied minors crossing the border in 2014, HHS set up several temporary facilities at military bases. Ultimately, ORR tries to find family members, foster parents, and sponsors to take in children. Parents are a preferred option, but it has not been a possibility for children who have been separated from parents who remain in detention. It is not clear if, under Trump's new policy, separated children might still be placed with sponsors, or if they are all returned to detention with their parents. There is no time limit on how long it can take to find a home for a child, but again, OR says that on average the process takes less than 2 months. By law, these relatives or sponsors must, among other requirements, show that they can provide for the minor, sometimes verified with home visits, and ensure the minor's attendance at future court hearings. The Trump administration has said that it intends to subject sponsors to increased scrutiny. Under these rules, the criminal background and immigration status of all sponsors and any other adult living in the household will be examined. Biometric data, such as fingerprints, also will be required. The checks will be performed by US Immigration and Customs Enforcement and not by ORR. Critics say that these new background checks will have a chilling effect. Under the current circumstances, given the anti-immigration rhetoric of the administration, made that few will be willing to come forward to claim the children, said Bob Kari, who was director of OR under the Obama administration. So will parents who are prosecuted be reunited with their children? Parents face a court hearing where, as Burnett reported, they may face objections from prosecutors if their lawyers try to bring up their children in a bid for leniency. If the parents are eventually released from detention, they may be able to take custody of their own children. In a statement to NPRI, ICE expanded on the process of family reunification. Drawing a parent's attention, ICE and ORR will work together to locate and separate children, verifying the child-parent relationship, and set up regular communication and removal coordination if necessary, ICE says. A hotline has been set up to help parents and children find each other. ICE will make every effort to reunite children with the parent once the parent's immigration case has been adjudicated. Parents being deported may request that their children leave with them or may decide to leave the children in the US to pursue their own immigration claim. For instance, they might suggest another family member in the US to sponsor that child, as described above. Though the New Yorker spoke to lawyers and advocates who said there is no formal process or clear protocol for tracking parents and children within the system, and that chaotic systems and inaccurate record keeping keeps it very difficult even to know which facility a child might be kept at. The New York Times reported that some children and parents have been deported without their children against their will. A 2-decade-old court settlement, the Flores Settlement, and a law called the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act both specify how the government must treat immigrant children. They require that immigrant children may be placed in, quote, the least restrictive environment, end quote, or sent to live with family members. They also limit how long children and the family can be detained. Courts have interpreted their limit as 20 days. Previous administrations released their families to meet these requirements. President Trump has said the law requires separate families, which is not true. His advisors have presented a more complicated argument for how the law requires family separation. The law prohibits us from detaining families while they go through prosecution, Nielsen said. Therefore, she says, we cannot detain families together. She argues that leaves the administration with the options of not enforcing the law, which it rejects, or separating families. But immigration advocates and legal experts say that there are other options, including those that previous administrations have chosen. Trump's new order has effectively requested a change to the existing law to loosen restrictions on the detention of children. So what was Obama's policy? The Obama administration established family detention centres that kept families together while their cases were processed. Trump's executive order appears to effectively revive this policy. The Obama-era centres were sharply criticised for keeping children detained even if they were still with their parents. A court ruled these detention centres violated the Flores Agreement and that families should be released together. The Obama White House also had a policy of releasing families through a program called Alternative to Detention that still allowed them to be closely supervised, for instance by giving mothers ankle monitors before releasing them. The ACLU welcomed the Alternatives to Detention program, but other immigrant right-wing groups had reservations. As Burnett reported, one for-profit prison company that was making money off immigrant detention was also profiting off those ankle monitoring systems. ICE tells NPR that the Alternatives to Detention program is still active under the Trump administration, but Trump had repeatedly said he opposes what he denounces as, quote, catch and release, end quote. So can families request asylum, allowing them to stay together? What is asylum? Seeking asylum means asking the U.S. to accept you legally because of prosecution you're facing in your home country. Crossing the border illegally is a misdemeanor for a person who's already been deported once. It's a felony. Both types of crime are currently being prosecuted with no exceptions, even if a person later requests asylum. Seeking asylum at a port of entry, however, is not a crime at all. Hypothetically, yes. In practice, maybe not. Families that request asylum at ports of entry are meant to be kept together while their claims are processed. But there is evidence that even families who seek asylum at ports of entry are being separated. One high-profile case involves a Congolese woman who had sought asylum and was separated from her 7-year-old daughter. In February, NPR's Burnett reported on the legal battle of Miss L versus ICE. Hers is not an isolated case, and according to immigrant advocates. Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Services had documented 53 incidents of family separation in the last 9 months, mostly Central Americans. Other immigrant support groups say there are many more cases. Burnett reported Jean Guerra of KPSBS in San Diego reported on the case of a Salvadorian father, Jose de Mar Fernandez, who says he sought asylum and was separated from his 1-year-old son, Mateo, despite having an original birth certificate proving he's the boy's father. In a White House press briefing Monday, Nielsen said, quote, DHS is not separating families legitimately seeking asylum at ports of entry, end quote. But she said DHS, quote, will only separate a family if we cannot determine there is a familial relationship, if child is at risk with the parent or legal guardian, or if the parent or legal guardian is referred for prosecution, end quote. Burnett also reported that some families are not being allowed to request asylum, that they are being repeatedly turned away and told the CBP facility is too full to accept them. Nielsen also denied that some asylum seekers who present themselves at the port of entry are being turned away, which would be a violation of international law. Quote, we are saying we want to take care of you in the right way. Right now, we do not have the resources at a particular moment in time. Come back, she said. End quote. Now, thank you for listening to today's episode, focused mainly on the child and family separations on the border and Trump's policy. As we said, is currently being investigated as a human rights violation. Everybody agrees, both on the Democrats and Republicans and all around the world, that the immigration rules, they are broken, need to be fixed. We need reform. whichever way we do it, something needs to be done because it's broken at the moment, not working. So thank you for listening to Brief History Podcast. We give you the history behind the headlines. The brief history is perfect. Under an hour. It gives you time, something to listen to on your commute home, in your lunch break, or any other time in your precious time. Even do it when you're doing your chores. Thanks for listening again. I've been your host, Andrew Knight. Sound is provided by Harry Edmondson. Please give us a 5-star review. Leave us a 5-star rating, also greatly appreciated. If you haven't already done so, subscribe. You'll be notified when next time we get an episode released, and you don't need to do anything. Most of the time it downloads anyway. We're on Apple Podcasts, anywhere else where you normally find your podcast, also on your favourite listening app. So find us there, subscribe, find us on the social media. We'll be History Podcast on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Snapchat. Comment, like, retweet, follow, friend. You know what to do, and let us know what you think, because we really want to hear from you, and we really do appreciate when you do reach out to us. So thank you again, and if you've got any suggestions of what we could do in the next episode, please do, because it's always hard choosing, but we'd rather take your choice over ours if we know that's what you want to listen to. So thank you again. This has been the Brief History Podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Knight. Thank you.
Face it, you're different. Everyone is. Same goes for your banking needs. That's why Columbia Bank offers an impressive range of checking account solutions specifically designed for, well, you. Looking for a rewards program? Check. High-yield checking? Check. Mobile and online banking? Apple Pay? Check. You'll always find more checking choices for you. So check us out at your local Columbia Bank branch or ColumbiaBankOnline.com. Count on Columbia.
Equal housing lender and member FDIC.